right, I'm back with Dr. Sohom Das, and we are going to try to explore the tricky situation of Marilyn Manson and possibilities of people coming forward. I haven't been able to give a full breakdown to Dr. Sohom Das about every accuser out there, everything going on out there, because there's a lot of accusers. There is a lot of moving parts. I'm still trying to get a handle on all this, but I wanted to talk to you today about a couple issues I have. One is, what is typical behavior, or shall we say more common behavior, because I understand nothing is concrete.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're talking about grooming here, aren't you? About predators.
Grooming, but also I want to talk about DV and SA.
Yeah.
This is my layman's perspective, and from what I've read, that there's typically a pattern of behavior that you will see with someone, and it's pretty consistent.
Absolutely agree with you there. So although there are variations of somebody's presentation, when you talk about people who either indulge in grooming behavior or separately commit domestic violence, there's certainly psychological cognitions that run through the same. They're very similar in terms of their patterns. Yeah, I completely agree with that.
I wanted to get your professional opinion on, because one thing that troubles me about this particular situation, no doubt there's big numbers. A lot of women are coming forward saying, he did this, and this. And their stories are extraordinarily similar. Almost like they're reading similar literature. I'll just put it that way.
And am I right in assuming that these women don't know each other?
But they do know
They haven't had contact. And they do know each other, okay.
And many of them are friends. And some of them share a lawyer.
Okay.
They helped each other write statements, at least a couple of them. So all of this is very, very relevant, I think, and that's part of where I'm going. But there's also several women who've all said, no, never. Absolutely untrue.
Yeah.
If anything, he actually is kind of vanilla, kind of tame, not really that type. And this kind of bothers me because, again, from everything that I've read and talking to different law enforcement, different things, it's kind of unusual. Like usually, if you have an offender of some kind, they do it over and over. It might be levels or whatever, but it's a pattern of behavior. I mean, if you're around somebody, you're intimate with them all the time, your core comes out. Is that a fair statement?
Yes and no, Eric. So it's just different between different perpetrators.
Sure.
So when you were saying that, the one thing that just jumped into my mind was Jimmy Savile. So obviously, there's no doubt about the horrific scope of the amount of abuse that he's occurred, but his personal secretary, who is an elderly woman now, who's known him for decades, absolutely does not believe any of the accusations against him, despite the overwhelming evidence. And she said many times on record, she could be lying, but I think she's telling the truth. She's like this sweet old woman. She's never been in trouble with the police ever in her life. She just doesn't believe any of it. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it's possible, if perpetrators are particularly, slippery and manipulative, that they pick their victims and their targets. Also, they might have a proclivity to a certain type of victim or a certain type of sexual partner. So I guess what I'm saying is that for a lot of people, what you're saying is correct. For a lot of perpetrators that we see, they're basically opportunistic predators. So they use any kind of opportunity to get sexual gratification. But there's definitely a small group. I mean, I've talked about some high profile cases. There's also some people that I've assessed professionally who commit their sexual offending in a very sort of restricted groups of people, not to everybody.
Okay, well, I'm going to get specific on, because I can see your point on it. I want to push back a little, though, because I think that the Savile case may be closer to like a Michael Jackson case. And the secretary would be closer to, let's say, I had one of Michael Jackson's lawyers on who said, no, absolutely, he did nothing like that. Yeah. And I imagine, and by the way, jury's out. I don't know if Michael Jackson did it. I figure he was acquitted. So I'm just going to say he was found not guilty. So I'm going to move with that. And the poor man is dead. So I'm not. Yeah. I'm not going to relitigate his case. I think that's a little wrong. But Jimmy Savile's secretary is not an intimate partner. He dated and was with Rose McGowan, lived with her, was engaged with her. She never had a problem with him. Even wrote in her biography how he was one of the good people. She is one of the founders of Me Too. Now, later on, she got mad that got brought up, and she's saying, I don't care, blah, blah, blah. That doesn't mean anything, blah, blah, blah. I am all for Me Too. But it's still interesting. He is with somebody. He lives with them. He's intimate with them. He has a full relationship with them. Is it unusual that some are, he's sweet as the driven snow, and others, he is a complete nightmare demon?
Yeah. So my answer to that, Eric, would be it's unusual, but it's not impossible. So one possibility is that it's all fabricated and that he's not a predator. He's not sort of domestically violent, which could fit in with the picture of exactly what you're saying from his ex-partner. Mm-hmm. Another possibility, I'm just saying it's a possibility, I'm not saying this is definitely what happens, is that it could be that he's violent in certain contexts. So if he has a partner that's doesn't challenge his beliefs, for example, doesn't challenge his opinions, doesn't answer back, isn't particularly hostile, then it's possible that he doesn't feel this need for power or control or dominance because he doesn't feel his authority is being questioned. Whereas in other situations, in other partners who maybe resist him for whatever format, whether that's just disagreeing with his opinion or refusing him, sex when he's in the mood for it, then it could be that he turns to violence in those situations only. So I suppose I'm saying I don't know what the answer is, but I think there's more than one potential answer. That's
well, like anything, there's definitely more than one. And I'll throw another wild card in. Could illegal drugs be a factor as well?
In terms of his behavior towards women, you mean? Yeah, absolutely. So we know that some drugs, things like alcohol and cocaine, disinhibit people. So it makes them less wary of the consequences of their actions. And if they are naturally a little bit aggressive, then it disinhibits them to the point that they can discharge violence with a lower threshold. Whereas other drugs, so for example, cannabis, heroin, have the opposite kind of effect. So yeah, depending on the drug, absolutely, it can increase the risk of violent behavior. Yeah, that's not just in domestic violence cases. That's in almost any type of violence, from robberies to assaults.
Okay, and I just wanted to throw it out there because I want to cover all the bases. And if we've done this effectively, pretty much both sides should be angry with us when we're done. Right? Isn't that how it works?
As long as they put the comments on your YouTube channel, not mine, then that's fine.
Oh, be nice, everyone. Okay, but now I want to play a video now of one of the supporters, little bits, and we can just go through and just look at and kind of just get a feel of what you think, because you've spoken to, I'm guessing, both sides of the equation. You've spoken to people who are both victims and people who are, I don't know if we say perpetrators, aggressors.
Yeah, absolutely. So you could call them perpetrators, offenders. So in my criminal court work, I will assess people that have committed a range of crimes, occasionally sexual assaults, domestic violence, to see if they've got mental illnesses and whether that was one of the contributory factors. And then separate to criminal work, I do civil court work. And it's usually in the context of seeing people often many years after they've been abused sexually, physically, more often sexually, when they were children. And I now assess them as adults to see the impact that that's had on their mental health, because they've got a civil court case against that individual or against the organization they represented, whether it's cub leaders or school headmasters, etc.
I'm going to put a pin in it. We're going to have to talk about repressed memories. Okay. That's definitely a factor. All right, so I'm going to play this, and I'm just want to get a feel for what you think.
And what was your relationship like at the beginning?
Hi. Sorry. Thank you for having us. I was kind of bombarded by Facebook messages, by emails, by Skype calls that I don't know if he remembered he did all of these different things, but we first connected over a Skype call in the summer of 2010. I was modeling in Bangkok, Thailand.
Ashley, you say that after a few months, your friendship evolved into a consensual sexual relationship, and every time you had a break from modeling in Asia, you would live with him in his Los Angeles apartment. According to you, this is when the psychological, physical, and sexual abuse started. Can you tell us about some of the things you say that he did to you?
Yes, it began quite quick. I flew out, and within the next day I was in his home. I woke up bound, and he was having sex with my unconscious body. So that was my my first experience, and then from there it was the abuse just worsened. I was dehumanized. I was degraded. I was treated like a an animal that. Yeah.
Hopefully that gave a little bit of impression. I'm going to go now and play another video. Somebody else.
So you first met Marilyn Manson, who's, by the way, his real name is Brian Warner.
Brian Hugh Warner.
Brian Hugh Warner, okay. In 2006, when you were just 18 and he was 37, okay. You say it started off as a friendship, but then you say that he started grooming you, which we often hear that term amongst abusers.
Yes.
From the abused, basically. So I'm curious, what drew you to him in the first place? And tell us how the grooming worked.
Well, in the first place, I was not drawn to him. He was drawn to me.
I see.
He approached me under the guise of work, false promises, and that is part of the grooming process. He was grooming me the second he said hello. Because grooming is when you present a false persona to somebody and you tell them lies to lure them into a false sense of security so that they become vulnerable around you. They start opening up, they start giving up their secrets and vulnerabilities. And so you're mining information. Yeah. You know, it's the epitome of a wolf in sheep's clothing. And once they have the information, once they know that you feel safe, they know that the manipulation can start. And so that's part of the grooming process.
Okay. Hopefully that gives you just kind of a sort of a baseline in presentation.
Sure. So there are a few things jump out to me. So the clip of the first lady, I think, is quite interesting because generally speaking, when abusers groom their victims, they tend to pick on people who are quite vulnerable. So they tend to pick on people who might be quite isolated, might be withdrawn, maybe don't have many friends or family. And they tend to the perpetrators themselves come from some element of authority. So I don't know about the first bit because I don't know enough about that victim, but Marilyn Manson certainly would fit into a category of somebody who comes from a place of respect or authority. So we've seen that loads of different times with celebrities quite recently. So R. Kelly would be a huge case. I don't know if you've heard of a man called Tim Westwood, but it's a big case in the UK because he's actually British, like one of the biggest hip hop DJs in the UK of all time. He's very old now, he's in his 60s, but he was using his position of being like the gatekeeper of British urban music to lure these young women, or black women, I should say, with the promise of like record contracts or helping them up in the world of music, and then sort of pouncing on them and jumping them and sexually abusing them. Allegedly, there's lots and lots of different allegations have come out. It's yet to go to trial. So I'm not saying Marilyn Manson is guilty. I don't think anyone can say either way, and I think we will find out as more information comes out. But if he is guilty, then it certainly fits the pattern of how people, especially people in authority, use their position to gain the confidence of vulnerable individuals. Having said that, one thing that did strike me as quite unusual with the first lady's report, I'm not saying it's not true, I'm just saying it's not typical, is that it appeared that he abused her very, very quickly. So I think she said, the very next morning after they'd met, he was abusing her sexually. And usually that's not how grooming works. Usually it's very gradual increases in boundary breaking, which is absolutely, gaslighting, pushing certain sexual boundaries, doing things that makes them feel a little bit uncomfortable, then doing a little bit more the next time. To take R. Kelly, for example, he was kind of, using these women as sexual tools for his friends. And it's a gradual thing. It's quite unusual for it to happen sort of overnight. So that's the thought about the first clip. The second clip, with all respect to Evan Rachel Wood, I think she's got the definition of grooming wrong. I'm sure the experience that she had might have been correct from her perspective, but that's not really what grooming is. Grooming is more about... It's less about kind of getting information to blackmail somebody. It's more about increasing somebody's confidence or reducing their suspicion with the perpetrator.
Normalizing behavior, right?
absolutely normalizing behavior, and it's not necessarily just towards the victim. It's also often, especially if it's a young person that's being abused, it's towards their family and towards their parents. So it's making the victim feel more comfortable with the perpetrator being in their life. And that might be initially with small physical contact, and then it increases to cuddling and kissing, and then eventually, sexual abuse.
Also, I don't know if it's 100%, but isn't grooming typically someone younger? So for somebody younger versus an adult.
Yeah. I think that's because I'm trying to think the right way to word this. I think because younger people, especially children, are so emotionally naive that it's easier to kind of emotionally manipulate a child than it is an adult. Doesn't mean it can't happen to an adult. It certainly can. You see it happen.
An adult would be more of a coercion than a groom, right?
Yes and no. So a coercion is more about making them do something they don't want, which is at the heart of grooming. But grooming is more about tricking somebody into thinking that you're their friend. So it's more about increasing their confidence in you, if that makes sense.
Okay, and grooming can also be not sexual. I mean, you could groom somebody into robbing a bank, right? If you're adjusting their natural values to fit with whatever you wish them to be.
Absolutely. So you're manipulating them for your own agenda. But just to finish off your previous question, grooming can occur in adults, but it's associated more with children because it occurs more often in children, especially emotional grooming.
You've talked to many known victims, as we put it.
Yeah. Is
the behavior consistent or something you've seen before for both of them? I mean, does it just ring like, seems about right, or no? Don't know.
Do you mean the behavior as I see them on the screen, or do you mean the behavior they're describing of what Marilyn Manson did?
Their specific behavior as they are presenting their.
I'm always a little reticent to comment too much on sort of somebody's body language and presentation. I will answer your question, but I'm just sort of prefacing it. And the reason I am is because, just from my clinical experience, people are they don't necessarily present in a predictable manner. Sure. So I'll be specific. They came across as very different, didn't they? So the first woman she looked really nervous right from the offset. She was quite sort of wooden in her posture and her body language. She seemed to be struggling to maintain eye contact, and she broke down. She could barely get the words out of her mouth of what had happened to her. Whereas the second woman, Evan Rachel Woods, even though she was talking about some very horrific things, she seemed quite confident, and she seems quite open about speaking about what happened to her. So we're talking about two victims who are saying very similar things, but they're presenting very differently. Now, I think there'll be a temptation by some people. When I say some people, I'm talking about people who comment on YouTube videos that I watch, of calling one of them, particularly the second one, a liar, because, if you really went through this upsetting kind of experience, then how can you talk about it so openly? How can you hold your head up? How can you smile? There will be some people that think that, and I've certainly read YouTube comments like that. I can't subscribe to that way of thinking because people process things in different ways. So just because Evan Rachel Wood just because she was upset and really horrified when this was happening at the time doesn't mean that she can't speak about it quite openly now, Well,
I understand. And something happened 10 years ago. You could separate yourself. I don't have it queued up right now, but one thing that is very interesting about Evan Rachel Wood's, somebody called it spell casting. And I thought that was a really interesting description. I have a video of Marilyn Manson, and he does that. That's how he talks. Okay. And that was a kind of a very interesting thing because, and I like many, I keep getting flashbacks with Amber Heard, Johnny Depp, because there's a lot of weird parallels there. Amber Heard kept dressing similar to Johnny Depp the next day. People, pointed that out to me, and I saw that. Is mirroring something you might see or not see? Is it an unusual thing in this situation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think when somebody is in awe of somebody who they believe to be in a higher status, or not even a higher status, but if somebody is quite charming and is able to change your opinion, then in that moment we see mirroring. So we see the trying to think what the word is, the least confident or the lesser of the two people copying their posture, their body language, their facial expressions, the way they gesticulate with their hands at that moment. I've never seen it where somebody's copied it weeks or months later. I was unaware of the whole Amber Heard dressing similar to Johnny Depp. So I've never seen it in, I'm not saying it can't happen, but I've never seen it in that format. I certainly have seen it in the first format. And sorry, Eric, there was something else that I forgot to get around to saying in my previous question. So I've taken on cases where one particular perpetrator, so for example, there's an infamous headmaster from Wales in the 1970s who abused lots of young boys at his school. He actually committed suicide, so he was never criminally charged when these allegations surfaced. But about when these men were in their 50s, I did a series of assessments on them to see the level of psychiatric damage, which helped with their compensation when they were suing the government county who employed this man. And the one thing that really struck me actually was that there's a big difference in the way they presented. So some of the victims would, break down in tears, we could barely get through the interview because they were so upset about what they were talking about. Whereas other people were still upset, you could still feel the emotion behind it, but they were very calm and calculated and spoke about it in quite a kind of robotic fashion. So the whole point of me saying this is that I think it's unfair for anybody to judge how a victim presents, because it's so variable that you can't make an inference whether they're telling the truth or not, ultimately, just from the way they come across in front of you.
Oh, and that's fair. And I'm back to Amber Heard. Sorry, but I do think that Amber Heard has spoken about it. And I think that she very likely was abused as a child or had something happen as a child. And part of why I think that is if you watch her sister Whitney. And what you just described makes me think of the two sisters, Amber Heard and Whitney. Amber's very aggressive in her behavior and outward mean demeanor. Yeah. And Whitney is very... Whitney almost feels, dare I say, broken. Yeah. In some ways. Would that be a fair analogy to what you were describing?
Yeah, absolutely. And not only is that probably reflective of the internal emotional turmoil that's going on, it could just be how sort of shy and confident people are in front of a camera, right? So somebody who's made a living from being an actress, that's used to having cameras shoved in their faces and surrounded by people, and being put in an emotional state, is probably likely to be a bit more detached than somebody who's a bit overwhelmed with the whole situation. Somebody who's used to being an A-list or a B-list celebrity for most of their life is probably going to be able to take that kind of pressure more than her sister.
Okay. Now, one more piece of information about the first person. A direct message exchange from Instagram has come out recently, where she was speaking to somebody, and apparently in this exchange stated that she was kind of put up to do this a little bit. And
are we talking about Evan Rachel Wood here?
Sorry. No, the first video, which would be Ashley Morgan Smith-Line. Right. The claim is that she's kind of put up to do this. By the way, that lawyer who was next to her is shared with another of the accusers.
Right.
And she also stated in the exchange that she was on ketamine during the interview.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I don't know behavior, but I'm thinking that you may have seen the effects of different drugs on people and how they're acting. Yeah. With that piece of information, which I held back from you completely, can you see anything? Does that click anything in your mind?
So I've definitely seen people on ketamine, professionally and also socially in various nightclubs. I mean, from my experience of watching people, they tend to be sort of very, very sedated, very sort of drowsy, very disconnected. So they're kind of looking around with slightly wild eyes as if things aren't real, or very sort of focused on small details. I don't think that lady really fit that picture. I mean, she to me, she seemed like somebody...
I'm tempted to look at it again because.
But I'm talking about. I suppose it depends on the dose of ketamine you've taken, really. But I'm talking about people who are sort of half asleep, who are slumped back. Mm-hmm. I've seen people in corners of nightclubs who are literally like that, and you can tell that they're on ketamine. She wasn't that. She was sure. Upset and she was tearful, but I don't think she was sedated.
Okay. I'm gonna play one more video. This is Evan Rachel Wood again, in a different scene, because on The View with an audience and the crowd, everything, that's one thing. This is her testifying and reading a statement. Now, I don't like the fact that she's reading a statement, but it still is kind of giving a different feel, if you will.
Right. Sure.
When I was a teenager, I met a man. I looked up to him in many ways and felt like we had a special bond, and I had no intention of it turning into something romantic. When it eventually did, I wasn't sure how to stop it, as he had a certain charisma and power, and I quickly surrendered to his charms. In the beginning, he treated me like a princess. I was smart, but a smart 18-year-old is still an 18-year-old, and I thought I had fell in love. It wasn't until much later that I realized everything he had told me was a lie and part of what is called the grooming process. He'd hidden a terrible drug and alcohol problem from me. He moved very fast in the relationship, asking me to move in with him almost immediately. There was a certain way he wanted me to look, otherwise I would endure name-calling and ridicule. He cut me off from my close friends and family one by exhibiting rage in some form or another when I was in contact with them. The only way I knew how to calm him was to give him what he wanted, which was me all to himself in total isolation. He had bouts of extreme jealousy, which would often result in him wrecking our home, cornering me in a room, and threatening me. I witnessed my abuser threatening people with force or legal action if he worried they would expose him. He bragged about being able to have people killed because he was allegedly friends with multiple gangs, and I watched him illegally collect data on people that he could use as blackmail. By the time I realized I was in a bad situation, I felt completely trapped and terrified for my life. He gifted me a cell phone, which I found out he was monitoring. He downloaded spyware onto my computer and hacked into my emails and social media accounts so I could not reach out for help. When my friends and family tried to intervene, I swiftly told them to leave because I was afraid of what he would do. He broke me down through means of starvation, sleep deprivation, and threats against my life, sometimes with deadly weapons, which would result in me having severe panic attacks where I was unable to breathe or stop shaking. Sometimes he would not allow me to sleep until I participated in acts of fear, pain, torture, and humiliation, which I felt powerless to stop.
I suppose when I was watching this, I'm sorry, I'm not giving you any definitive answers here. I'm just talking about what possibilities, because there are so many possibilities. So when I was watching this, I was thinking that what she's describing is very, very typical of this kind of toxic behavior within a relationship. So either it's completely true, that's one possibility, or she's done her research and it wouldn't actually be that hard to find out what the typical behaviors are. But to go through some of them, or to summarize them, somebody who commits either coercive or even domestic violence within a relationship is often quite controlling. So they monitor their partners, they become very, very jealous, and they want to know where they are constantly. And even if they do something, if their partner does something fairly innocuous, like going to the shop, in the perpetrator's mind, they're sort of insanely jealous, and they want to confirm that they're not off, flirting with other people. It's almost a delusional type of jealousy. The other thing that's very common is socially isolating the victim. So they force them eventually to kind of break ties with all their previous friends and family. So everything that she's describing is like textbook how somebody in that relationship would act. As to whether she's telling the truth, I personally believe her, but I don't think we can't know definitively, because, as I said, it's not hard to figure all that stuff out. If you are lying, it's not hard to know what to lie about, I suppose is what I'm saying.
I will tell you that some of the niggling issues I have, or the main niggling issue on this in my mind, is specificity. I don't know, but I don't like things that just fit. Right here. Here's this, is this, does this, is this. I feel like there's always some muddiness, that nothing is like completely clear, and that's why we need to see people like you to help us. You determine if something is grooming. I don't determine if it's grooming. I tell you what my problems are, or what I'm saying, and I don't usually fit exactly online when I'm describing things to you, or am I wrong? I mean,
no. I see your point. I think you're saying that it's almost too perfect. Maybe, is that what you're saying?
It kind of is, especially when it's repeated.
Yeah,
I suppose when you use the term grooming, we use the hot terms. Now, when you're with a patient or someone you're evaluating, do they say he groomed me?
No, they probably wouldn't. But then you have to appreciate there's a couple of things. One huge thing is that when I'm making my evaluations, when I'm giving my evidence, I don't go just on what I'm seeing in front of me, either from
Sure.
the perpetrator or the victim. I go on hard evidence, right? So I go on the police reports. You know, in cases like this, sometimes I have pictures of the victim after they've physically been beaten up, or I've seen witness statements of neighbors who've seen the individual get beaten up. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm happy to comment on these videos, but until we actually have that evidence or a lack of that evidence,
Oh, sure.
everything of what we're doing is a degree of speculation. Yeah.
Oh, yes. There's a warning label on my video. No, I'm just kidding. This is complete speculation, but I'm just wanting to
and I
talk
suppose
this
the other thing that I would say is you're right. Where the most people that I see who've been a victim of grooming don't use the term grooming because they don't necessarily know what it is. But I would see them, if it's a criminal case, I'd probably get their witness statements very soon after this has all occurred, within the first few weeks. Whereas this is slightly different, I think, because she's obviously had time to practice. You know, whether it's factual, which I believe it is, or fallacies, which is possible, but not what I think. She's had to turn to practice and kind of digest it. So I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that just because she's using the right legal terminology doesn't mean necessarily that she's making it up. It could just mean that she's had time to kind of look into it, to seek legal advice, etc.
Okay, it's interesting, and you're saying, you know, if it's true, of which I believe it is, you said a couple times. Why does it trigger you one way or another, or do you just default on I'm going to believe him, and you know, we'll keep fact checking, trust but verify, to quote a former president?
Yeah. I think that's a good question. I think I probably, maybe it's a slight bias that I have, but I generally believe female victims generally. I think probably because in my professional career I've seen, so you'll know this, but for your viewers, my job is never to decide whether somebody's guilty or innocent. That's only for the courts. Right. My job is, after they've been found guilty, to try and figure out if there's any sort of psychiatric reason. You know, if there were psychotic hearing voices would be an example. So I'm not used to deciding whether somebody's guilty or not guilty. I only see cases where domestic violence or grooming definitely has occurred. So I think that skewed me to believe the victims and to not believe the perpetrators, because that's what I see in my clinical practice.
Okay, and that's fair. I wanted to ask, especially you know, the two pretty distinct presentations from the same person.
Yeah, and I suppose the other thing is the other thing that muddies the water a little bit is that you told me that a lot of the victims know each other and are friends. Despite what I just said, that does make it a bit more complicated, I think. So I mentioned this DJ Tim Westwood, and again, the criminal trial hasn't happened, but what was remarkable is there was lots of victims who didn't know each other, never met each other, but the way that he allegedly attacked them, you know, in the back of his car, taking them to his flat, you know, making promises and then suddenly stripping his clothes, jumping out of the bedroom. What he did was almost identical in every single time. And you would have thought, even though I'm not a judge or a jury, to me that indicates a strong possibility of guilt. Slightly different in the Marilyn Manson case if they all knew each other, because if it is a big conspiracy and if they're after, you know, if they're lying for money, which I don't think is the case, but if it is possible, then that muddies it, doesn't it? Because it kind of increases their ability to do that.
Okay, I'm going to bring up one last point, because I'm holding you long and I apologize.
That's quite right.
Can we discuss repressed memories? Now, you haven't heard that from any of these people, but I will tell you that multiple of these accusers all had repressed memories that seemed to clarify later on. And that's one of my little niggles, because I think of like McMartin Preschool and Elizabeth Loftus work that has been done. If you have people who know each other, people who get together, and I'm not saying that it's necessarily specifically deceit. I mean, our memory sucks, okay? If I see something and then you tell me what I saw 10 minutes later, I might wind up just saying, yeah, oh, you know what, you're right. I totally missed that he had a gun. I just thought he was, you know, that was his phone. But you're right. Oh, my God, that was a gun. So what are your thoughts overall about repressed memories, especially for adults, as adults, later on as adults?
Yeah, good question. So repressed memories are, they're a contentious and quite controversial issue, I think, within the world of mental health, within psychiatrists. And some psychiatrists don't believe in them as a concept. So they think that it's far more likely for somebody to have a false memory than a true repressed memory. As you said, people remember things far worse than they assume that they do, and especially when it's clouded with emotion. So a traumatic event, when somebody's panicking, they tend to, because of their distressed state, their level of focus tends to be distracted. So they've got all this adrenaline going through them, their heart's pumping, they're probably in a state of panic, they're probably thinking about ways to escape. It's actually quite hard to accurately code traumas effectively in that state. So I guess this is a roundabout way of me saying that I'm skeptical about people that claim that they have repressed memories in general. I think the exception to that might be when it happens to somebody who's very, very young. So, when your memories are forming, when you don't really understand the situation, a 3-year-old might not understand if they're being abused. An adult absolutely definitely would. So I suppose I give them a bit of leeway in that. You might know this more than I do, but I believe there's at least one case of a man who was charged with sexually abusing his own daughter because she came out with these apparent repressed memories through hypnosis. And I'm trying to remember the details. I think he actually went to prison.
Loftus' work.
Okay.
Is on that.
And then did he go to prison and then he was released afterwards due to...
I don't know the full details. The bigger one I know is McMartin Preschool, where that was part of the Satanic Panic. And they literally were saying there were torture rooms under the school. Right. And, I mean, it was like just really grandiose, kind of similar to what maybe we just heard.
And did it turn out to be false, or what they said?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the other thing
I spoke to the FBI agent, Ken Lanning, who investigated that and, or handled a lot of that.
I suppose the other issue for me is that people unintentionally, subconsciously, are far more pliable and easy to persuade than we think. So if something's strongly suggested to somebody who thinks they might have a repressed memory, unintentionally an idea can be planted in your head. So if a hypnotist, a therapist, a police officer even is saying, either directly or indirectly through their tones, we think this happened to you, and the person's really not sure, it's not unusual for them to take on that into what they think is a true memory. So for all these reasons, I'm a bit skeptical about repressed memories and the accuracy of them.
If I told you that multiple of the accusers all had repressed memories, these memories were repressed as adults, and they have come back to them also as adults, these people who all know each other, would it start to give you pause?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. Yeah. I think it would make me feel very suspicious because at a stretch, I could accept that maybe, one, it's very rare for this to happen in the first place, for it to happen to one of the victims, maybe a couple of them. A stretch is possible. For it to happen to several of them, that would make me, very skeptical about the whole thing. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, and in fairness to everybody, as I stated in the beginning, I did not tell Dr. Sohom Das anything other than I want to talk about some things. Can you confirm you know very little, if anything, about this case at all, other than there's a case out there?
Yeah, I heard of allegations against Marilyn Manson, but I didn't know any of the details. I'd heard of Evan Rachel Wood. I hadn't heard of the first victim that saw the clip of. So I was, this is me reacting live rather than my calculated answers.
And in fairness, any incorrect information or anything that was given to him that is not clear or not complete is completely my fault and is not your fault, Dr. Das. So I want to put that out there because I definitely want to clarify, roles. So
Marilyn, if you're watching, you have to sue this man below me, not me.
All right. Well, Dr. Das, this has been outstanding. We can find out more from you on the YouTube channel, A Psych for Sore Minds.
Yeah, that's right. So it's my YouTube channel. I kind of talk about areas related to mental illness or offending. So sometimes I do high profile cases. I mentioned Tim Westwood before, R. Kelly. I've done some stuff on Will Smith recently in his apology. And sometimes I talk about my own personal cases and do my own kind of psychoanalysis. So,
and soon to be Marilyn Manson, because I stoked your curiosity.
Yeah, maybe.
All right. And folks, he also has a book out.
Yeah, I do. It's called In Two Minds. It's like my professional memoirs. So it is cases that I've seen on behalf of the courts. It's my most shocking, bizarre, and kind of gruesome cases dissected.
All right. Well, thank you. Now, folks, as I always say, it doesn't really matter what I think. It kind of does matter what Dr. Doss thinks because he's a professional, but I really want to know what you think. So please comment below and tell us, do you think that Marilyn Monster, not Marilyn Monster, new tongue, just breaking it in. Do you think that Marilyn Manson is a monster amongst us? Or do you think that we need to explore every single case for every bit of evidence and there could be some nuance in here? Or do you think he's not guilty? He's being set up. Please let me know. And until next time.